Hello, and a very warm welcome to today's talk, the Neobank Formula, Scaling Across Products and Markets. I'm Elliot, I run content here at Elsewhen, and will be your host today. I'm also joined by Nadav, who is the Director of Product and Strategy here at Elsewhen, and Rochelle, who's Lead Product Designer. But before I pass it over to them, I just wanted to remind people to stick around for a Q&A session right at the end, where we'll be taking questions from the audience. Now, without further ado, over to you guys.
Good morning, everyone. It's Nadav, and thanks everyone for joining us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube. For the next hour or so, Rochelle and I will take you through a set of stories that we think are interesting, some CX principles, and a few of our workshops and templates that we prepared. I'm going to share my screen. Excellent. And I'm going to start with a quick introduction to who we are. So I'm Nadav Mordechai. I'm the Director for Product at Elsewhen. I've been in the product space for about 15 years. Within those, I've launched and scaled multiple products, many of them within the banking space. I'm also a business coach and a mentor. And Rochelle, do you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. Thanks, Nadav. My name is Rochelle. I'm a lead product designer here at Elsewhen. I've been working in the design industry for over 10 years now. Previously to Elsewhen, worked at a fintech startup that you might have heard of called Bud. And I also specialize in speaking and also workshop facilitation, which you'll see a little bit more of later in the talk. Back to Nadav.
We mentioned Elsewhen a few times by now, and I want to do a quick introduction to Elsewhen. Elsewhen is a digital product consultancy. That means that everything that we do lives in the digital space. And our mission is to really accelerate innovation and solve business critical problems. We've been selected one of Europe's 1,000 fastest growing companies in 2023. And many of our clients tend to be on quite the advanced and big, kind of large scale size FTSE companies, S&P companies. So we've worked with the likes of Spotify, Google, Microsoft, and specifically within the banking space with many others. And so the reason we thought we might have an interesting story to tell today is that we've worked on a story and we're going to exploring a story together. The story of a company that was chosen as one of Times Magazine 100 most influential companies for 2024. And I promise you it isn't going to be open AI. In fact, as you could guess by now, it is a financial business. Our focus within that company, so we're going to talk about who we are in a second, but we're going to talk about some of those principles or kind of customer experience principles that really let them become a regional powerhouse in the banking space. And we're going to look at that growth journey that they've done through that very particular lens. Right? So we're going to isolate the experience layer from many other things and have a deep dive into that and see how they've done what they've done. And lastly, we're going to spend the second part of our time together going through some of the examples, but also what are some things that you as business strategists, as designers, as product managers can take and implement within your businesses very quickly. And so the reason we feel quite comfortable talking about these stuff is primarily two, right? A lot of what you're going to be seeing here today is based on our actual work with clients within the fintech and banking space. A lot of these concepts, a lot of these questions were asked within different clients, within different teams that we've partnered with, and in our experience helping those teams to create better digital experiences, we've also looked through many other examples. So not just with clients, but also what good looks like on pretty much a global scale. And distilling all of our knowledge into frameworks is never easy, but that is the attempt that we're going to be taking today. And this is what a lot of what you're going to be seeing here is based on. So this is actual work with clients and how we think you can take that and implement that within your businesses. Let's jump straight in, right? So I want to talk about maybe a little bit of complexity within the financial industry space. We called it the profitability complexity syndrome. And the question here is, banks have been very profitable for many years. That's no secret. We all know that. But that profitability often comes at the price of creating very complex products. Banks are almost, by definition, have a bit of a knowledge gap from their clients. They have a knowledge advantage. In fact, and many of the products they design tends to be on the complex side, that side that leaves a bit more power to that financial institution over their clients. I've seen this firsthand in my years in banking, and I definitely still see it within clients and kind of the organizations that we work with. And I guess the point here is that dynamic really puts a lot of power in the hands of very few banks and leaving their customers in a disadvantageous position. It is really important, and especially within the context of the bank that we're going to be exploring in the next few slides, where we talk about populations that may not be quite as well as we are familiar with in Europe and in the UK. But that syndrome has pretty much sits at the basis of many fintechs that we see. And the next point I want to stress here is that over the last decade or so, we've started seeing more neobanks creating simplified propositions and creating simplified user experience for the clients. And that strategy was very useful and very successful for many of them when it came to client acquisition and user acquisition, but not so much when we're looking at how many of those users have moved the primary banking relationships into those neobanks. We see that in the UK still. It has been quite a problem for many banks for many years. And the reason that's been an issue is that at some point, banks needed to start showing positive revenue, right? And so these were pretty much the only two models for a long time. We've seen either incumbent banks creating complex products and making really nice profits, or fintechs creating amazing products but not making any money out of them. But that's changed, right? And over the last couple of years, last 3 or 4 years, we've seen that neobanks, and specifically those who serve retail clients, have really matured, and they've shifted their focus from that rapid expansion, that unsustainable growth, into models that are a bit more sustainable and helps them generate positive revenues. If you look at the data here, so we listed down some of those better known banks. We've all heard the recent stories about the coming Revolut IPO. Many of us have seen the recent news from Monzo and Bank. And there's one fintech at the top of that list that we think is actually quite interesting, and that is the Brazilian bank, Nubank. Nubank is, if I go back one slide, has moved from a pretty deep red territory when it was losing money to a positive of hundreds of millions of dollars, just over £1 billion profit in the last financial year. And we find it quite interesting, right? Because Nubank operates in an entirely different financial ecosystem to the European one. It started in Brazil and it's now expanding. We're going to talk about it in a minute or two. And it does serve those clients that are traditionally less empowered, less connected to the financial ecosystem. And it does that in a way that is really interesting. And what is interesting in that is that from almost its very beginning, the founder and CEO of Nubank, David Villers, worked with that sort of statement in mind. And we've touched on that earlier. And that is that concept or that notion that financial services are complex because the banks wants them to be that way. They want to keep it that way. And that means that powerful and profitable banks on the one hand side and unempowered customers on the other hand side. The core purpose, and that is the sentence that we've highlighted here, the core purpose for Nubank is to break that complexity and to empower people. And I want to start getting deeper into that question and ask, really, what does it mean to become a non-complex bank? And what do we talk about when we talk about empowerment in that context? So in the next few slides, I want to talk about how we investigated that question and how we went about that concept of complexity and empowerment. And the way we I guess the research that we've done and the work that we do with clients really brought us to a point where we think about it in terms of those customer experience principles, right? So like I said earlier, we almost want to isolate the customer experience level from overall growth. So we're not going to be talking about aspects like operational aspects of call centers. We're going to talk about mainly the digital aspects. And I want to break them into three sort of key principles. The first in those principles is we labeled it as creating helpful, contextual, and simple products. Or in other words, how can we reduce financial complexity, how we can keep users informed about their financial situation and enable easy decision making. You might argue that these are very core aspects of creating financial experiences. But as we're going to see later, Nubank is really taking them to a next level, something that is really simple and helpful for clients to understand and build on and make decisions. The second principle here is where we talk about creating mutual value. And creating mutual value, as we saw earlier, is not an obvious concept in banking. And our thinking here is banks, and especially those who started from the ground up in recent years, sit on amazing amounts of kind of crazy amounts of data, right? And Nubank is one of those banks that, despite being operating in Brazil, in that kind of slightly underdeveloped territory, have managed to create really impressive usage of data and put that data to the benefits of its clients, right? So we talk about creating those genuine relationships and how we can use data in the right place to get clients, get users the better product for them. And we're going to see some examples for that in a minute. And then lastly, the third principle that I want to touch upon is that singing local new tunes, what we called. So when we think about Nubank, as well as other banks, especially Revolut, they all started in one region, and Nubank is doing tremendously well in Brazil. It has just under 100 million clients in that region, but it's also expanding to Mexico and other regions. And the way it's been done is quite unique in the sense that a part of the product remains similar between those different geographies, but each and every one of them gets its specific characteristics, its specific tunes that really makes that product feel local and not something that is different and kind of stranger to the country they're in. So with that in mind, I'm actually going to hand over to Rochelle, and Rochelle's going to take you through some of the principles and how some of the examples for those principles and how we think they've been implemented really nicely within that Nubank ecosystem. So Rochelle, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nadav. So yeah, I'm just going to walk through a few slightly more specific examples of the actual CX behaviors within the Nubank app that we've seen that really reflect these three principles. But first of all, I'll just go into the principle in a little bit more depth first as well. So starting with helpful, contextual, and simple. For us, this is all about breaking down financial complexities, particularly for excluded customers, and actually providing those users and all users with more straightforward and effective ways to stay informed about their finances and make decisions with ease and confidence. So let's dive into an example. So we're actually zooming into the income screen here. So this is a customer that might be interested in their income and trying to find out a little bit more about it. So what can they do first? So in this case, they want to answer the basic question. So what is their overall income, maybe this month, this week, and just making that figure really easy to find. And then next, we actually want to give the user a little bit more context behind this figure. So in Nubank's case, this is actually kind of a layer deeper in the UX. So you can click in and really understand, okay, what has made up that overall figure? Is there some tax I'm paying, maybe different forms of tax? And basically, how does all that come together to form your income? And finally, and this is arguably the most important, actually, this thing of guiding users towards the next best step for them. So once they have a really good understanding of their current situation and all of the data points that bring that together, actually suggesting simple actions for what to do next. So in this income case, it could be depositing funds, transferring funds to a different account, something like that. So let's move on to the next principle. So this one, as Nadav mentioned, is all around creating that mutual value for the bank, but also the customer. So finding those moments within a user journey that hold that potential for value creation. Often this is a touch point where maybe the customer is thinking of taking out a new product with the bank. So that at that point, it's all around offering the right product at the right time for that customer. So if we dive into an example of this one, Nubank is actually really great at creating these relevant recommendations powered by financial data. So these two screens on the right that you see are the kind of home dashboard for customers. And that purple section at the very top is where these relevant recommendations sit. So Nubank has identified these as probably the most valuable content for customers and therefore put it kind of front and center for them to see as soon as they open the app. So they're highly relevant nudges, and they also allow you more kind of relevance and convenience based on how much access you actually allow. So Nubank has great like open finance integrations. So basically your experience is enhanced the more data you actually provide for Nubank. So this is a great example of that kind of value exchange. And we also see a few examples of what these recommendations could be. So on the left, there's actually a verified call feature. So something that Nubank is particularly thinking about is, you know, scam and fraudulent calls. They're a fairly new bank. So they're actually raising top tips for their customers to actually identify what a legitimate call from Nubank looks like. And then on the right, you can see a couple more examples. The first one is about someone's statements closing and they can actually do another action now. So they can pay it and release a new limit. The second one is around a new type of account that Nubank is offering customers. So in this example on the right, you can actually see the recommendation hierarchy coming out. So they are very intentional about basically prioritizing the customer-centric recommendations over the business value recommendations. So in this case, they've decided that you know, that statement closing is the most important thing for the customer to know, but they might also be interested in this new type of account, but it's a secondary recommendation. So moving on to our third principle for Nubank. So as Nadav talked about, again, it's all about singing local tunes for the customer in their kind of culture and region while maintaining consistency. So it's all about this kind of flex and scaling and adaptability. So a great example of this for Nubank is actually specifically looking at their onboarding for 3 different markets. So on the right, we can see Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia. And probably immediately one of these stands out to you guys as Colombia on the right, because they've clearly decided to use quite a different style of photography here. Perhaps in that market, Nubank isn't such a no brand. Maybe they're trying to enhance trust with their customer base. So they've actually chosen to put in a picture of a customer's face, enjoying using the app. And maybe this is a very intentional move to kind of increase new customers opening accounts in that market where there's maybe a little bit less trust. Another thing you can see as a difference between these screens is just as simple as the CTAs. On the left, for Brazil, we have 1 CTA. In the middle, there's 2, and on the right, there's 3. So this is clearly a system that can really flex to suit those local requirements. So I'm actually going to pause on this screen for a few seconds here and just let everyone in the room really take in these numbers about Nubank. So that first one, 100 million customers. I mean, I think a few of you have probably seen this figure on LinkedIn or other news sites recently, but it is, for me, completely mind-blowing that they've managed to get to that milestone. By far the biggest neobank in the world at the moment. Another crazy stat for me is 45 financial products. That's a very impressive amount of products for a fairly new bank to be able to release to the market. And then there's these 3 markets, which is actually kind of an interesting one. I mean, if you compare that to someone like a Revolut, it's maybe sounds a little bit more conservative. But Nubank is very intentional about how they kind of release these markets, as we just saw on those onboarding screens. And they're very kind of thoughtful and sympathetic in that process. So I bet you're all thinking, this is great, but what could I do about this tomorrow? So this is where our framework comes in. So we really want to help you unlock scalable CX at your organization. So we've actually put together quite a comprehensive board in FigJam that I'm going to dive into, and you will get access to this. It's on the Figma community right now, but I will just do a quick walkthrough. So I'm just going to swap my screen sharing here. Give me a few moments. Okay, should be coming through shortly. Nice. Cool. So just a quick intro to this board before we dive in. We've spent quite a bit of time today digging into how Nubank has actually scaled their CX. But every business, of course, is different. And we wholeheartedly believe at Elsewhere that a tailored approach is the best way for organizations to serve their specific scaling needs and actually be successful in hitting that CX vision. So that's why we've created this framework. So this framework is very much based on our experience running this process with various different financial organizations. So collaboration is really at the heart of this process. As you can start seeing in some of our cards here, we recommend starting with a collaborative workshop, our CX scalability workshop, which brings together CX managers and individual contributors to co-create ideas, and then actually gathering together a core working group to refine and finalize the framework in those second 2 steps. So this process I'm going to go through is fairly comprehensive. I'm going to take a bit of time to walk you through it and also go through some of our kind of top tips to help you get to a successful outcome. But first of all, let's just have a read through a bit of an overview of these 3 steps. So you start with the CX Scalability Workshop, which is our most detailed board, as this is what's kind of kicking you off in the process. This is all about getting everyone on the same page, maybe reviewing some best-in-class examples, and also generating ideas around what those CX scalability principles could look like. Next, you want to actually synthesize the workshop outputs and get to your 3-ish, could be 2, could be 4, your key scalability principles, and actually draft the first version of this framework. And then in the final step, you add those granular CX examples, like some of those examples we just went through in the deck. And then actually you have the ability to kind of export and share this framework to share it with teams and stakeholders around your business. So let's dive into this first workshop. So as you can see on the board, I've included a brief kind of introduction canvas. We really encourage you to fill out particularly this top section around thinking about why your organization specifically needs to use this framework. We added a few kind of popular reasons. You might be trying to establish a shared CX vision for the future. Maybe there's a pivot to profitability and therefore scaling up the tool. Or maybe there's a strategy change to expand geographically. That's exactly what this framework is designed to help you for, but it's helpful to kind of start off with why your organization needs to do this. As part of this workshop, as I mentioned, we're going to be establishing the shared understanding of the current state, reviewing a few examples, and then doing some ideation. So let's dive into these exercises. So first of all, you want to actually take some time to reflect on what everyone in the room feels is the current state of the CX. So this shouldn't be any kind of vision or like goals or what you're trying to be. This is literally just the status quo of your app or your kind of web solution as you see it today, and getting that from everyone in the room, and then having a chance to discuss, some key themes or maybe some interesting differences that you see. So once you've done that reflection, we're actually going to go and spend a little bit more time on defining these scaling goals. So as I mentioned at the start, I'd highly recommend including your kind of overall why before you actually start the workshop. But this is just an opportunity for everyone in the room to kind of contribute to that. Maybe there is some more detailed goals that they've seen in conversations during the business, or there might be some kind of additional goals that maybe other people in the room haven't thought about. So I think this is a really helpful exercise just to get everyone on the same page and really understanding what scaling means for your organization before getting too deep into what it means for the CX. And then off the back of that, we actually want to validate future vision for the customer experience. So ideally, this is something that you might already have in your back pocket, but some organizations we know don't have a CX vision. There might be an overall company mission that you can kind of substitute in for this, because often a company mission is actually arguably talking about how a customer would experience what your company is trying to produce. But yeah, it's an opportunity for everyone to align on that kind of overall vision or North Star of what the customer experience is trying to achieve. And then our final exercise in this kind of expectation setting is assessing the technical and data capabilities gap. So it's fairly early in the process, but we think it's actually quite helpful to start thinking about this when you start thinking about that vision. So the idea is that between the status quo that you did up here of the kind of current state, the goals, and the future vision, you can actually start to understand some key gaps that you will need to start working on in order to achieve that CX vision. So this could be things like, how could you actually utilize generative AI to maybe automate some things or improve customer satisfaction, for example. So the next step in this workshop is going through some best-in-class examples. I won't go into this step in too much detail. We've added the Nubank example that we went through in the deck to get people started, but highly, highly recommend finding a few specific examples of kind of best-in-class versions of what your organization is doing or best-in-class peers. And then the final step for this one is that key ideation step. So you want to get everyone in the room thinking about, okay, so based off that kind of expectation setting exercise and then the best-in-class examples, how do we feel about what our scalability principles should be? And just giving everyone an opportunity to kind of voice their opinions and get some buy-in from your whole team. So once you've had that collaborative workshop, you're ready to actually go into the synthesis step. So this kicks off directly after. So it's all about actually synthesizing that workshop. But first of all, I just want to pause on a couple of our Elsewhere tips at the top of this board. So as you might have noticed when I zoomed in, this board almost like looks a lot kind of easier and simpler to fill in, but it's actually the trickiest part of the process. Some people call this bit the messy middle. That's a little bit negative, but this, I'm sure a lot of people in the room will empathize with, like, the synthesis step is the most important and often most difficult step. So we'd really recommend taking some time, take a day or two with a core working group of a few individuals with good contexts of projects to actually do this step. The other thing you might have noticed is that we recommend coming out with three scalability principles, which is basically the outcome of the synthesis. So I just wanted to include something about why 3. From our experience working with lots of different kinds of organizations, 3 is actually a really great number that allows scope for kind of a few different concepts to be explored, but it's still tight enough to communicate and stick to as a CX team. But I will say you can flex this for your organization. As we've mentioned, every organization is different. So maybe 2 works for you, maybe you need 4. But we do find like 5 or more of these principles tends to create more challenges because it's just a little bit more difficult for people to kind of understand and integrate into their work. So the second part of this kind of synthesis step is all about drafting that framework. So hopefully you're starting to see how all of this comes together. So you've synthesized the workshop, you've created these 3 principles, and then those 3 principles can go straight into this framework draft. So you also should have your CX vision that we established in that very first workshop. And the final step that you do here is actually describing the principle in a few words. Now, the reason we made this a standalone activity is we actually think this, again, is quite a core part of this process. We want you to have a think about, like, what are the key words in that principle? It shouldn't be too many words. Maybe like 3 to 5 words is a good amount. But that description just allows you to think about, okay, a little bit more practically, like, what does this feel like in the day-to-day experience? And another quick tip from how we use this process day-to-day is this is actually a great point to go and get some feedback from stakeholders. Feedback is not something we've integrated into these boards specifically because we understand that at different organizations and different businesses, feedback cycles can be quite different. Sometimes it's more of a waterfall approach. Sometimes it's very kind of lean and agile. So we wanted to create the space for different types of teams to work. But just as a bit of a reminder, great point to get some feedback in the process if you haven't already. And moving on to this last board, as you can see, as you move through, these boards almost become, or they feel like they're easier to fill in as you get to the end. You kind of start going wide and getting a lot of kind of data input, and then you're slowly kind of synthesizing it and refining it to this final version on the right. So going through finalizing your framework. So again, really important step in the process is adding these CX examples. So this is like the kind of CX bit of the Nubank deck that I went through, where we were going through some specific examples. So why is this important? It's really important because it actually connects the kind of strategic CX work to the real world, which in itself will make your framework much more actionable when it's actually put into the hands of the CX kind of individual contributors and managers to actually use this framework in their day-to-day work. Basically, it makes the whole thing a lot more usable and practical. So just as a quick reminder, this is the example we looked at for Nubank. So their vision was break complexity and empower people. If we just look at one example here, so for singing local tunes, they want to adapt sympathetically for different customers around the world. And what's an example of how they do this? An example is that onboarding that flexes thoughtfully to new markets by using brand imagery and headlines that are specifically designed for those markets, and also CTAs that are bespoke to the local user needs. So as you can see, it's really getting into some granular detail about what we mean by this principle, just one example. So once you have kind of thought about these examples and hopefully added a few screenshots as well, you should end up with a kind of draft framework that looks something like this, which is basically your completed framework. And then on the right here, we can see that, okay, this is basically just a cleaner version of the framework to help you communicate it with teams in your business. But you might be wondering, okay, this is great, but what next? The work is never finished. If you want to spend another week doing some more time on this framework and make it even more useful, what's another thing you could do? So basically our top tip for a way of communicating this framework in examples. So it's actually build out your own kind of broader FigJam board, or it could be a slide deck that go into a little bit more detail on those examples. And you could even think about adding multiple examples for each principle. For example, for one of the clients we work with, we came up with 3 specific CX examples for each of the 1 principles. And by doing that, it means that you're just kind of arming your team with more kind of practical use cases of what that principle actually means in the digital CX of either your own or a kind of best-in-class products, which we found is a just really strong technique to get buy-in and actually make this framework usable. Cool. So on that note, I think we're going to jump back to the slide deck. Cool. Thanks, Yaffa. So I'm just going to pop to the next slide, and I think we'll hand back to Nadav to close us out.
Thanks, Rochelle. That was awesome. So much content to go through. And I appreciate we've blitzed through all of that very quickly. And to leave you with something tangible at the end of that conversation, we actually prepared 2 things that I invite you to kind of scan the QR code on the screen and go and read in a bit more detail. So the first one is a really amazing and invaluable piece of research that was put together by our research team. We put together 4 different blog posts that goes into pretty much each of the topics that we've covered today in much more detail. We look at aspects like scaling digital products and financial products from just one product into a multi-product proposition, into multi-markets and multi-customer segments. So there's a lot more to read, and they are full of examples from Nubank and from many other banks. The other one here on the right is a link to the framework that Rochelle just shared. Some of our frameworks, and we tend to do that every now and then, we publish a piece of framework for the community. Our previous frameworks have been downloaded and duplicated tens of thousands of times. We've done some of those together with Spotify, and so they are very, very useful, and I invite you to go and download them and put them to use. And with that, we are going to close that section and open the floor for questions.
Great. Thanks, guys. That was really, really interesting. I think got plenty of questions here, but I think the one that always wants to get asked is the AI one. So first and foremost, with all the stuff that's been going on with Gen AI, should CX frameworks be adapting? How can they be adapting? What's going on there?
You want to go?
Sure. Do you want to take that? I'll take
it. Yeah.
So
you go.
We mentioned.
I'll add.
Yeah. I mentioned. I gave my take on that. I think I mentioned a couple of things earlier about Nubank and how they use data from really the ground up. In other parts of our work, we look at concepts around generative UI and how LLMs and generative AI in general could be embedded into financial products and other products. I guess my take on that is that some of these frameworks could become a lot more executional once we embed generative elements into them. So I can think here of, for example, aspects that are related to that creation of mutual values, right? So a generative tool could become a lot more sophisticated in floating those values, in helping customers ask the questions they need, get the information they're after to make a decision in that space that we've created for them, for that value exchange moment, what we call here. And then I guess the other part of that, when we talked about expansion into different regions, many generative elements could actually make that expansion a lot more efficient, a lot quicker, with interfaces being designed in a much more efficient way, with even more emphasis on those local nuances and how new territory is kind of adapted to that product and how a new product is adapted to a new territory. So I guess that's kind of my take on that. It will probably not change the frameworks as much, but would just make implementation and execution a lot quicker and a lot more robust.
Can I add something?
Yeah, I think you have something to add, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I had a nice phrase that I think is worth thinking about for this kind of generative AI piece. It's something we use internally quite a bit. So we call it augment, don't destroy. So when you might be working or you might have some kind of existing CX vision or principles that you're working with that have basically served you very well up until today, but you're thinking, oh, there's all these new technologies. What's our CX in the age of generative AI? And our advice is basically like, you don't need to start from scratch. There's probably a reason that all of your customers have been enjoying your CX so far, and you want to actually augment and build upon that success rather than kind of drawing a blank slate and totally redesigning what your CX should be with generative AI tools. So that's one thing. And the other thing I want to say just quickly is something we didn't actually mention too much about Nubank is really good at using data, and I'm sure they do a lot of great generative AI kind of stuff at the moment. But basically, the interesting thing with them is it just feels really embedded within all of the way that they talk about their CX and their product. It's not like an add-on, it's just part of the product. Like I talked about those relevant recommendations. That's probably got heaps of really clever tech sitting behind it. So yeah, I think those are two kind of key things I would consider.
Nice. And another question I got is, we talked about Nubank, obviously. How do other banks differ in their CX approach? I know we said that there's probably no one size fits all. What are some of the other approaches you guys have seen?
Should I take it? I'll take it. So I guess the obvious example here, it's a really good question. I guess the obvious example here is perhaps Revolut. I touched on Revolut when I showed that table of different banks. Revolut, in a way, is a completely different story, right? They have about 45 million users in about 45 different geographies. Whereas what we looked at with Nubank is about just over 100 million users in only 3 geographies. And that to me is going pretty wide and relatively shallow. I think that kind of changes with Revolut over the last year or two, versus going very deep and zeroing in on that one territory. I think with Nubank, the opportunity was pretty clear if you read that story from the very beginning, right? So that underserved population in a pretty big country that could go through that shift in financial services and transition over time. When we see a different approach, when I talk about that different approach from Revolut, so again, it's many different products in many different markets. Some of the things are not actually that different. Some of the examples that we saw with Revolut, for example, are very much catering when we talked about singing those local tunes. Some of the themes or some of the implications they had to bring into the product to serve, for example, their clients in Australia or New Zealand, or where people might have a really big face tattoo, right? Really does work into those elements of how do you take the product and you make it compatible with that local market, right? So I think some of them, the key difference for me is that going really wide on many different markets. But I think many of those elements are still relevant within that even very different example of Revolut.
Michelle, do you want to say anything
to that?
Well, I think you captured that pretty well, to be honest, Nadav. I think maybe move on to the next question. I don't think we've got anything to add.
I think it sounds like it's basically about the simplicity that they're bringing is kind of a universal need in lots of ways. So across markets, that's the big pull. So I have another question here. Are there any incumbent banks that have replicated this approach for their complex product suite? So I guess that's about, retroactively going the other way with this.
There's one staring us in the face, and it's called Commonwealth Bank. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but I happen to be Australian, so I know a little bit about Commonwealth Bank. But really interesting incumbent example. I'd argue one of the most kind of digitally savvy incumbents that we did quite deep research into. I think, a lot of the incumbents are kind of playing catch up, but it feels like Commonwealth Bank is actually kind of establishing some of these new digital ways of working in Australia. You can actually, I think everyone can see the screen that we can see. But just to pull out a couple of examples, like they have this kind of smart search feature, which is probably using generative AI, and these kind of little squares you see below the icons, those actually flex for specific people. So depending what you use the app for, and if you're, say, like a personal banking customer or a business banking customer, or you use a credit card a lot versus a current account, you will see different stuff on your home screen. So yeah, I think that's an example of just, I mean, I think personalization is a big buzzword, but often personalization is part of this scaling effort to still kind of create a focused and clear, simple customer experience that works for lots of different types of customer. But yeah, I'd say Commonwealth Bank would be a really great one to look at if you're looking for an incumbent doing some interesting stuff in this space. I don't know if Nadav has anything to add. Go.
Yeah, maybe just a quick one. I think I touched briefly earlier about serving new customer segments. I think one of a byproduct that we saw when we looked very deeply into Commonwealth is that many of its services been like seen greater adoption within the older population, right? So something that is perhaps an exercise in almost financial inclusivity. They've been able to show how all the populations, like those over 65 years of age, have started adopting and using more and more of the services. So that's kind of the last point on that.
One that just has come to me anyway is I was going to ask how this fits into the wider picture of super apps and how these neobanks really are kind of leading the charge. Is that all again to do with stuff like simplicity and ease, or is there, how intertwined is some of this stuff with that push towards that sort of trend?
Rochelle, do you want to take that?
Yeah. So it's an interesting one. We actually talked about super apps quite a bit on kind of various projects recently. One thing I would say is there is a cultural difference between East and West in this thing. I think the super apps have been very successful in countries like China. I think there's a reason that, you know, countries like the UK haven't quite seen that. I can't, what's the messaging app called? I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about. But there's a few apps. You're about to say it, Elliot. What's it called?
WeChat.
WeChat, that's the one. But yeah, I do think it's interesting. I think you are seeing some kind of amalgamation in these kind of like Western cultures. Like, for example, you know, seeing maybe wealth and banking products being brought into the same app that previously would have been like, you know, you've got kind of a trading experience on one app and then your current account and your credit cards on another app. Like, maybe they can all be brought together. And I do think there is some, it can make life simpler, right? Like if all of that stuff is in one place. But I do think it depends. It depends on the use case. I'm going to give that annoying response of it depends on the specific kind of organization. Again, like you should run the framework and see what you get out of it. But yeah, it really depends on what you're trying to do and the kind of customers you're trying to serve as well, like how they're looking to use those tools. Just using that like wealth and banking example, actually, like something to think about is customers probably want to check their bank account fairly regularly, like every day or every week. That's not something that's recommended to do with, say, like a kind of long-term investment products. You know, I'm not talking about crypto here. That's a bit of a different thing. But say you have kind of like an ETF fund or something like that. Like the recommendation is that maybe check that every year or so. So yeah, I do think there needs to be thought behind whether a super app is the right move for your organization, is what I would say.
That's completely fair enough. And it kind of draws a tiny bit into, I think this is the last question. With Nubank expanding into the Middle East, what might be some of the cultural nuances Nubank will have to be mindful of in order to succeed? Is that something that we could answer?
With a very limited anthropological knowledge, I reckon. I guess what kind of first things that kind of comes to mind are perhaps elements around Sharia principles to investments or kind of lending. I'm definitely not an expert in that space, but I would imagine, and we see some movement in the sort of wealth management space within that region. I would imagine lending might look slightly different in that space, and lending, as we all know, is quite critical to banks actually making money, as well as financial instruments for investments that may or may not be available. And kind of saying all of that with the caveat that I'm not an expert in that region. Or do you have any further knowledge on that?
I think you're 100% right. I was going to mention Sharia as well. But I also wonder if we take Nubank specifically as an example, because I think that's what he's asking about. I think the Middle East is a very different market to South America, just culturally. So like that onboarding example that we saw, I think you might end up seeing quite a different looking onboarding experience, potentially for, I'm going to put myself on a limb here and say a slightly more conservative Middle Eastern customer probably is the status quo. So they would probably, maybe they need to develop an alternate version of their tone of voice for that region, just as an example. So yeah, I think, and that actually touches on another thing. Like I think a lot of these customer experience things we're talking about can also touch on kind of brand and marketing. And I think, you know, the best organizations like Nubank really understand that those two kind of departments should be working in tandem, and really just everyone needs to understand their core customer that they're trying to look at in that region, and basically how best to access and make that customer feel comfortable.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions. Let me just double check. Yeah, I think that's what we've got. So thanks, guys. That was actually a really insightful start to the day. A big thanks to everyone for joining as well across LinkedIn, YouTube, X. I hate saying it's still X, and I think Facebook too. But we'll be sharing the recording soon, so stick around for that. You will be getting all of this stuff and some of the materials we've been talking about, some of the links, so you can find those blogs, you can find the framework itself. But in the meantime, feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. Connect with us on LinkedIn. We're very happy to continue this conversation. Do come say hello. And I think that's all in all, that's it. Thank you very much, guys. Have a great, lovely end to your day.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Jade.
Thanks, everyone.